Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Mark Smith. I am Group Managing Director of People to People here in Australia and Frog Recruitment in New Zealand. It's a fabulous afternoon here in Sydney, and I'm delighted to have. We've had a few technical difficulties before we've gone live this afternoon, so I just wanted to let everybody know that. So we're going to see how we go. We've got a few issues with the internet there, so hopefully we'll be able to get through this, because I'm delighted to say that on loan from Indeed we have Callum Pickering here this afternoon. He's the Asia Pacific economist for Indeed at Indeed's hiring lab here in Australia. I think I'm sure Callum will let us know he's based in Melbourne. He's previously been with CP Economics and with the Reserve Bank, and has been economic editor for Business Spectator and the Eureka Report. So I've got to say, though, I'm also a little bit of a fan of Callum's Twitter feed, and I would encourage everybody to jump online and have a look at that. More recently, he's been posting blog posts about and a couple that I picked up here. One was the sectors that were driving the recovery here in Australia, and also the fastest sectors for jobs growth here in Australia and New Zealand as well. So I'm sure he's got lots to talk about. And so good afternoon, Callum. I know we don't have an image here, or we don't have a video for you, but I'll hand it over to you and to your presentation. And what we'll do is if you've got any questions during the presentation, then please pop them into the chat on your screen there. I'll make note of them, and we'll have a Q&A session with Callum at the end of his presentation. But over to you, Callum. I think you're muted there, Callum. So we'll just see if we can get Callum to unmute. So we'll just bear with us here a second. There we go. Over to you, Callum.
Sorry about that. Sorry about the introduction. It's great to see so many people tuning into the webinar. Hopefully, me being on mute will be the last technical issue we deal with today. I can safely say that I'm happy to see the end of 2020. It's finally within sight. It's a month to go. I suspect I'm not alone in that sentiment. It's been a challenging and frustrating and difficult year for all of us. Australia have established themselves as the gold standard for COVID responses. And yet 9 months after the crisis began, we're still bearing of its considerable economic consequences. Every economic outlook is framed by what we have recently experienced. 2021 will be no different. Much of it will be spent recovering from the job losses that we've experienced throughout the COVID-19 crisis. Policymakers expect a full recovery will take at least a couple of years. Yet because of our handling of the crisis, both Australia and New Zealand can enter 2021 with a cautious sense of optimism. We are well placed to emerge from this crisis. Yet life for many of us, both work and non-work alike, will remain fundamentally altered for the foreseeable future. I bet this picture is familiar to anyone with young children. It is certainly familiar to me. Before COVID-19, my work was 9 to 5, maybe a few emails or the occasional meeting outside normal hours. Suddenly my wife, I'm an economist and she's an accountant, while also providing time to my daughter, 2-year-old daughter. Work was suddenly something that I fit in around my other duties, early in the morning, late at night, and during the blissful quiet of my daughter's afternoon naps. That normal 8-hour day suddenly became a 16-hour day, and that persisted for months. I'm Melbourne-based, so overall I spent about 6 months in pretty strict lockdown. That's been my COVID experience. Others will have had very different experiences. hundreds of thousands of people lost their jobs or had their hours or wages cut. The inconveniences that I experienced pale in comparison to that. But whatever your personal experience, it's likely challenging and difficult, and certainly very different. And for a good chunk of it, you were probably stuck at home. By mid-April, population movement in Australia was down almost half, and in New Zealand by around 3/4. Even today, movement is well below normal levels. Fewer people are leaving their home for work or to eat out or to go shopping. Working from home is still more prevalent than it was pre-crisis and may remain so for the foreseeable future. Today, I'll be highlighting a range of economic developments for Australia and New Zealand. We have a lot of data and graphs to go through. First, there'll be a discussion on recent developments, including the impact on employment and hours worked across both Australia and New Zealand, as well as discussing the emerging recovery. Second, Indeed's data. How has recruitment and job seeker behaviour changed? And finally, we will discuss the outlook for both countries with regards to the labour market itself and recruitment. What can we learn from what we went through over the past 9 months? While both Australia and New Zealand took the threat of While both Australia and New Zealand took the threat of COVID-19 seriously, their respective approaches led to very different economic outcomes, the scope of lockdowns and the government fiscal response. For example, job losses in Australia were greater than New Zealand. However, hours worked across both countries fell by a similar degree. And the overall economic impact of COVID-19 was greatest in New Zealand, despite fewer job losses. Australian employment in September was 3.1% below its level in March. For New Zealand, it was down just 1.1%. However, economic activity was another story. The economy 7 June quarter, while the New Zealand economy contracted by an eye-watering 12.2%. What unusual historically, since jobs and growth tend to move in tandem. So what's going on? What's happened to, of course, this unusual? This implemented a widespread wage subsidy to support the economy. However, the wage subsidy covered a large share of around 61% of workers at its peak, compared with 27% for Australia. This helped the relationship between employer and employee in New Zealand. Fewer employers in New Zealand had to make the painful decision to sack staff. Right, they were protected from what was happening across the economy. However, while there were jobs in New Zealand, there wasn't necessarily work. In Australia, employment and hours worked moved closely together throughout the crisis. In New Zealand, that simply wasn't the case. Employment and hours worked at all, as you can see with that second panel. In New Zealand, many people had jobs, but in name only. Many were in government support, but not actually doing work, or alternatively on greatly reduced hours. That also was true in Australia to a certain degree, but the strong relationship between employment and hours worked for Australia indicates that this was not. The good news, of course, that hours worked have recovered strongly in both countries, but also in New Zealand. And that suggests to me that the wider coverage of was there were holes in the Australians that I think probably greater job than
Okay, we may have.
I wanted to highlight most of the jobs. Sorry, what was that, Mark?
We lost you there for a second, but you're back. I'll leave you to it.
Okay, thanks. Focusing on Australia for a moment, I wanted to highlight that most of the jobs being created in the recovery are part-time or casual work. This graph shows the decline in employment from March to May, the height of the crisis, with the recovery from June to October. Job losses were high for both full-time and part-time workers. However, just 17% employment cover full-time jobs. Part-time employment in Australia is now higher than it was COVID-19 crisis. And that's a result that I think is not particularly intuitive. That's not something that most people would expect. But that's precisely what's happened in recent months. And this is also reflected in hours worked. From March to May, part-time hours fell by 20%, reflecting the shutdown of hospitality, recreation, and retail, among other industries. But by October, part-time hours worked were only slightly below pre-crisis levels. Yet full-time hours worked were still down 4.5%, and that's a pretty big decline overall. Perhaps an underappreciated consequence of the COVID-19 crisis is that some full-time jobs have now become part-time jobs due to a lack of available work. For example, someone who once worked 35 to 40 hours a week, a full-time schedule, suddenly finds themselves working maybe 25 or 30 hours a week. And that's something that's likely happened across the Australian economy, across a wide range of different industry groups. People just aren't working as many hours as they used to. From a jobs perspective, women generally have been harder hit by the COVID-19 crisis than men. That's true in both Australia and New Zealand, although the impact in Australia has become less pronounced over time, owing to the sharp rebound in part-time employment throughout the recovery. In Australia, employment for men is down 1.4% compared with pre-crisis, while for women, it's down 2.1%. In New Zealand, male employment is down just 0.6%, with a 1.7% decline for women. In family dynamics, there has been a tendency for the woman to maybe not work as many hours as a way to look after kids or the elderly or people with special needs during the crisis. And there's also been a particularly large impact upon women who are single mothers for obvious reasons. Job losses in Australia remain highly concentrated in sectors such as accommodation and food services and arts and recreation. That's been true throughout the crisis, reflecting widespread limitations on hospitalities and gyms. But we shouldn't underestimate how large some of these falls are for other sectors. Even a sector such as construction, one of the smallest declines, sort of middle of the table, has experienced a decline in employment that in normal times would be considered a disaster. Right, our sense of perspective has become a little bit lost due to what we've experienced over the past 9 months. There have, however, been some industries where jobs have grown during the crisis. Leading the way is agriculture, although I suspect that's probably more bushfire related because this graph is measuring employment change since February. And obviously February was a pretty tough period for the agricultural sector. So they're probably just experiencing a bit of a recovery from the bushfire period. But there has also been strength in areas such as public administration, finance, real estate and mining. All have defied the national trend. The unemployment rate in Australia is currently 7%, up from 5.2% before the crisis. In New Zealand, it's 5.3%, up from 4.2%. It's understandably lower because, as those earlier slides showed, there was a much smaller employment impact in New Zealand compared with Australia. Recruiters should also pay close attention to underemployment. That is, people who have a job but would prefer more hours. The underemployment rate in Australia is above 10%. more than twice the rate in New Zealand, owing to a greater share of the population in part-time or casual work. Around 1 in 4 Australians work fewer than 30 hours a week, compared with 1 in 5 New Zealanders. Australia has had an underemployment problem since the global financial crisis, and there's been very little improvement over the decade before the COVID-19 crisis. Often businesses are reluctant to take on full-time staff during a recession or a difficult economy, which means that underemployment may remain stubbornly high, even as other measures of labour market conditions improve. And I think this can be an opportunity for some businesses out there. If you are a business that can offer full-time, stable employment, that's very attractive in a market where there is a high level of unemployment and underemployment. That makes you an attractive business or company to work for. Younger people have experienced greater hardship throughout the COVID-19 crisis. In Australia, employment for those aged 15 to 24 has fallen by 5.5%, while in New Zealand, it's fallen by 10.6%. Huge declines. In Australia, there has also been a sizable decline in the 25 to 34 age bracket, while other age groups have been relatively unscathed, and that's true for both Australia and New Zealand. The impact of a recession tends to linger longer for younger people. They often find themselves competing against older workers for the same jobs, and their lack of experience or maturity often counts against them. That was true in the early 1990s and the global financial crisis. It will surely be true again during the COVID-19 recovery. And again, I see an opportunity for recruiters in Australia to target that 20 to 34 age group. That's an age group that combines cutting-edge skills, university degrees, and often solid work experience, right? They're a good investment for this to make. Now, shifting our focus, we're going to look at some of Indeed's data. Most of the data we'll look at thus far in government sources, the Australian Bureau of Statistics or Stats New Zealand. But I wanted to focus on Indeed's data and show some of the in our platform over the past 9 months. Indeed track every website, including information on job title, sector, whether the job is full-time or part-time, as well as content. Just as important, we track all of this in almost real time. So we're seeing documents that aren't necessarily showing up in a government source yet. Postings in Australia the same time on what we saw back in April, when postings were 56% below. Improvement has occurred as the economy has opened up. The pace of improvement has been gradual. It certainly didn't happen overnight. And it was affected to some degree when Victoria re-entered lockdown. And I'll have more on that in the next slide. Conditions have been similar in New Zealand. Job postings a initial hit and have recovered at a slower pace. On the 20th of November, job postings in New Zealand were tracking 0.5% at this point last year. One reason that job postings in New Zealand have been slower to improve is simply because jobs were slower, and therefore there were fewer positions to fill as the economy emerged from lockdown. Right? New Zealand observed that relation to employers and employees, and so they didn't have to hire as many people. That's in contrast to Australia, where many businesses needed to hire them again as the economy opened up. So I think while you look at job postings in Australia, seems like it's in a stronger position, instead, New Zealand's probably doing a little bit better because there just wasn't that level of job loss early in the crisis. They're in a better position. Victoria's second lockdown, beginning in July, reduced hiring activity considerably, although there you see that on that first panel there, with that pink line sort of declining from July onwards. But there's been swift improvement as restrictions were lifted. That contrasts with what has more or less been a pretty consistent improvement for the rest of Australia. One point I did want to emphasise, while returning to trend is great, and it's been a big improvement, ideally we'd like hiring activity to be above trend. And the reason for that is simply because space between those blue and pink lines represent hiring that would normally have taken place but didn't. In order to get the unemployment rate back to 4 or 5%, which is where we want it to be, we're going to need higher than normal hiring so that the economy can catch up. Now, catch up is occurring in some occupations, but not for most. So this table here shows the occupation groups where hiring is either much higher or much lower than last year's trend. Both Australia and New Zealand are experiencing catch-up in dental, loading and stocking, and production and manufacturing occupations, among others. But there are still some sectors where hiring is very low, reflecting the ongoing damage caused by both the lengthy shutdowns and an overall weak economy. Hospitality and tourism, the prime example. In Australia, some engineering roles continue to struggle. That likely reflects the fact that a lot of projects would have been delayed or cancelled owing to shutdown, while in New Zealand there have been fewer openings for childcare workers. This is of activity and how it has evolved compared with a year ago. Each country is creating more of some types of jobs than normal and less of others. For example, Australia is creating more jobs than normal for drivers and personal care workers, also more in construction and finance, among others. And this means that there is greater competition in these areas for available talent. However, Australia is creating fewer than normal jobs in sales, food preparation, and administrative assistance. In these areas, there's actually competition from an employer standpoint for the talent that is available. In New Zealand, we're seeing job creation in customers, loading and stocking occupation. Australia also in driving and construction work as well. But New Zealand is creating fewer opportunities in sales, administrative assistant, and education. The COVID-19 crisis has also changed how employers advertise and how seekers search. This graph shows the share of job postings on Indeed that utilise remote work in their job description. Phrases are family friendly or work from home, among others. Jobs featuring remote words have increased around 2 as a share of all job postings during the COVID-19 crisis. 7% of Australian job postings and almost 3% of New Zealand job postings feature such keywords. Australia consistently ranks near the top countries Indeed operates in with regards to remote work opportunities. We have a very high share of part-time and casual work in Australia. I think second or third amongst advanced economies, and that's reflected in the the phrase that businesses use in their job options. And job seekers are keenly interested in these remote jobs, or these jobs formed remotely. At its peak early in the crisis, remote searches in New Zealand were almost 3 times normal levels. In Australia, they were 2.5 times higher. So this was early in the crisis. Even today, searches in Australia are up 50% compared with the average in January and February this year. In New Zealand, they are up by a quarter. We are actively seeing both job seekers and employers responding to the new is open. Reality is that working from home will continue to be more common than before the crisis. There are people at home, even once offices and factories and all of that return to normal working conditions. So let's focus on the job seeker. On Indeed's platform, we can track key they put in the search bar, or the jobs they click on. We can link resumes uploaded to the website to search or click behavior to track how job behavior might change over time. The following slides shows some of that research, some of what we've been interested in during COVID-19 crisis. In this table, we match the last job title against the jobs that what we are interested in is whether they are considering a career switch. Are they considering alternative career choices? Found is that there are a range of occupations clicks on types of have increased COVID-19 crisis. Work engineering are considered career switching greater numbers. Again, perhaps because existing projects were or cancelled during the crisis. This is up 8.4%, and for mechanical engineers, up 5%. A range of occupations heavily targeted by economic restrictions have seen higher level of outclicks. Food preparation, wellness, fit firmly into that category. If there are limited opportunities in your existing career, you may always a career change, even temporarily. And I think that's what we're observing in that top panel. Of course, the occupation considerably during the crisis. This has been led by healthcare-orientated occupations, such as nursing, physical, personal care, medical technician. Workers in software development, a job that can easily be done remotely, are also less likely to be considering a career change. And all of this, a lot of opportunity in your existing career, and the economic environment is particularly uncertain or concerning, you're going to be reluctant to consider a career change. Right? There's no real point to doing so because you are quite safe in your existing career. This slide in the following slide breaks down this data further. Electrical engineers are considering a career change, but targeting. It turns out they want jobs that utilise their existing skill set in occupations such as installation and maintenance, manufacturing and production, and construction. And we see that trend throughout our data. Job seekers try to make career choices that utilise their existing sets easily transferable across industries or occupations. Engineering is a great example of that. While career choices tend to be more narrow. Now this is the same as this table, except it's focused on healthcare. I'm not going to dwell on it too long, since most of you will not be in the healthcare space and may not find it all that interesting. But I find it interesting how linked these three occupational groups are, with workers showing a clear interest in moving between them. You see that nurses are interested in personal care. Workers are interested in personal care and nursing roles. People who are in personal care are interested in nursing and therapy roles. They're all moving between these roles because they share a lot of the same skill set. Okay, and those skills are interchangeable between roles. Now, today we've covered a lot of ground. There's been a lot of data. There's a lot of things going on. There's a lot of moving parts to the economy. And not all of the data is nice to look at. We've obviously gone through a pretty tough period in both Australia and New Zealand. Almost every slide that I've discussed today we could go into far greater detail with. I could probably spend a good 5 to 10 minutes on each and every slide that we've gone through, but we don't have that time. But I do hope that this snapshot of labour market dynamics has been informative. I hope that our technical issues haven't made it too hard to follow along with what I've had to say. To finish with, I wanted to discuss the labour market outlook. What we should realise from the outset is that the outlook for Australia and New Zealand is still highly uncertain. Thankfully, some of these uncertainties have become clearer over the past 6 months. This is a slide that I've used in various webinars since the crisis began. Compared with back then, we now have a good understanding of how dangerous the virus is. We are more confident in our ability to treat or prevent the spread. Both Australia and New Zealand have done a particularly good job of that. Yet there is clear uncertainty surrounding government policy and its impact on households and businesses going forward. Will the reduction and eventual removal of JobKeeper and JobSeeker support measures prove disruptive? That's possible, but we don't really know how big an impact that will have. But it's something that we're going to be dealing with next year. There is also uncertainty surrounding the global response. The response from some major economies has been insufficient, which potentially creates a long-lasting recession and slower global recovery. The availability of a vaccine is incredibly important on this front. But the simple reality is that both Australia and New Zealand are pretty small economies by global standards. And so what's happening in the United States and Europe and the UK is going to have a big impact upon how our economy evolves over the course of 2021. Finally, the response of businesses and consumers is uncertain and frequently changing. Behaviour will continue to evolve as the Australian and New Zealand economies recover. The questions remain. How cautious will households be? Will they return to restaurants or shopping centres in pre-crisis numbers? Remember that first graph that I showed, the one about population mobility, and the fact that it's still well below normal levels? Part of that reflects changing behaviour from households in both Australia and New Zealand. On the business side, will cost cutting reduce investment and hiring activity? Wage subsidies have also distorted business operations to a certain degree. So we don't know how lasting the financial damage to small and larger businesses will be. That will become increasingly clear over the next 6 months. And that could also be an issue that we're dealing with next year. Personally, I can see Australian and New Zealand economies pretty well positioned for recovery. We both have a highly skilled and adaptive workforce, one that adapts quickly to the changing composition of jobs being created. Fiscal support measures remain in place and are being gradually removed. So there still is a degree of support there that will keep the economy ticking over and hopefully improving over the next 6 to 12 months. COVID-19 is under control. Life has mostly gone back to normal. It's crossed in that regard. However, we must remember that the impact of recessions tend to linger. This graph shows previous recessions and downturns in Australia over the past 40 years and how long it took to recover, how long it took employment to get to its previous peak. A full employment recovery took 4 years in the early 1980s and 2 years in the early 1990s recessions. That's a pretty big period. Now, the COVID-19 crisis was certainly much deeper than a normal recession, owing to its unique characteristics. We've never seen a decline in employment of this nature, but also the recovery thus far has been swifter. Again, owing to the unique characteristics of the COVID-19 crisis. Most of the job gains that we've had so far reflect the fact that the economy is opening up. I suspect the gains that we make from here on out will be much more difficult. I think that the dark blue curve will begin to flatten a little bit because of the sort of more persistent or longer lasting impact of COVID-19 on the Australian economy. Both the Reserve Bank of Australia and the Reserve Bank of New Zealand expect employment rate to remain elevated over the next couple of years. They are not expecting a swift recovery, and this is what their forecasts look like for the unemployment rate. So both central banks expect the unemployment rate to increase a little bit in the near term and then gradually improve from there. What is clear is that COVID-19 is going to be with us for some time. It's going to impact both countries' economies throughout the course of 2021 and beyond. We're not going to get back to what we were quickly. And that's precisely what you'd expect when you're going through such a significant economic event. It was the sharpest decline in economic activity on record for both countries. And obviously that's going to have a big impact for years to come. Another important factor for the economic outlook is skilled migration. Skilled migration helps to address skill shortages that are in demand sectors such as tech or professional services or healthcare. In the June quarter, skilled migration to Australia was down 4% compared with a year earlier. In the September quarter, it was down 46%. So there was some recovery, but not much. Now, this is a big change, and it's certainly one that's going to impact our government, particularly for highly educated, highly trained roles. Vaccine change quite a bit, but realistically, we brace ourselves for at least a couple of years of skilled migration that is well below normal levels. Skill shortages will emerge or become further exacerbated throughout this period. Employers may need to develop new strategies to offset the impact of talent that is more difficult to find. There'll be some roles that are just going to be really hard to fill until skilled migration levels return to something that better resembles normal. So what does all this mean? Hiring activity has improved in both countries. We're not seeing wide just yet. Ideally, we'd want hiring activity to be well above its trend last year. That's not the case for most occupations thus far. Unemployment and underemployment are elevated, which means that some roles will attract candidates. Then from a recruitment perspective, there's going to be some roles that are just going to be a bit of a pain to fill because you're dealing with so many candidates. But that's necessarily to reduce skill shortages because job losses are highly concentrated amongst the young and inexperienced. Skill migration is a problem that could exacerbate some skill shortages in areas such as professional services, healthcare and tech. A vaccine might be our best hope for a swift improvement on this front. And finally, there remains a high degree of uncertainty. A lot can and will change over the course of 2021. Effective vaccine will certainly help to reduce uncertainty, but in all likelihood, Australian and New Zealand businesses will be operating in a tough and uncertain economic environment next year and beyond. And thank you.
Great. Thank you, Callum, and apologies, everybody. I know that it is a little bit of a pain with the internet connection there, and Callum was coming out and coming going. But I think that graphically we got to see a lot of information there, which was fabulous. Now we're 40 minutes in, so we've got a whole bunch of questions that have come through here. So we'll see if we can get Callum to answer a few of these. If I could just read these out to you, Callum, and if we can go from there. The first one is from Melissa, and she's sort of making a comment here, but I thought I'd read it out as well. She said that the federal government is communicating a 3.3% growth in the economy for the last quarter here in Australia. We're apparently out of recession. Are we really out of recession, and what does that mean?
So normally on a recession, they do it based on whether there's been 2 or more quarters of consecutive declines in economic activity. Now, the fact that the economy expanded means that we're no longer technically in a recession. However, I would argue, because the economy is still 3.8% smaller now than it was at this time last year, that the economy is actually still in a recession. The technical recession definition is a bit silly to me. I think you have a look at the economy, you look at what's happened. We had a 7% decline in the June quarter. We've had a modest recovery in the September quarter of 3.3%. We still have a long way to go. And the Reserve Bank of Australia expects that the economy won't get back to where it was before the crisis until the end of next year. So until we get back to where we were before, I would consider the economy to be in a recession.
Okay, so 21, we're still going to be in that situation, so likely 22. Susanna was surprised by the retail trade numbers in terms of that sector and why it hasn't been as negatively affected. Have you got any comments on that?
Well, certainly early in the crisis, it definitely was affected to a large degree. But over the past 3 to 4 months, we have seen quite an improvement in the retail sector from an employment standpoint. We've also seen a high level of spending across the retail sector, which has likely helped employment in that space. And another thing that we've seen, which I didn't show today, was that hiring for Christmas is very high right now. And that suggests that retailers are pretty optimistic about the outlook for the retail space. And so I would expect that retail employment will continue to improve over the remainder of this year. Okay,
that is interesting. And Daniel here says that he's surprised to see that customer service wasn't a rising sector in Australia. Do you have any comments on that one as well? I know that at People to People, our experience is that there's been demand, say, in South Australia, and there was been some organisations bringing customer service teams back on shore. What's your view on that, Carl?
It's a sector that I haven't closely in, so I'll probably be speculating a little bit more with that. So it might be that I should probably look into a little bit more and maybe do a little bit more research in. So keep an eye out. I might have something in that space soon.
Right, fabulous, fantastic. So Margaret here says, typically the job market slows down from now until the end of January. Do you think this will be paid given the graphs all indicate an upward trend in ads since the bottom of March? Will companies be confident enough to rebuild staff levels from now on?
Yeah, so usually hiring does soften considerably through to the end of the year, and January remains very weak as well. It will be interesting to see whether this year follows that trend. Because like I suggested in the presentation, we need to see some sort of catch up in hiring activity. And so I wouldn't be surprised if hiring remained a little bit stronger than we normally see over sort of the Christmas and January period as a way for businesses to increase their staff. Like I said before, the retail sector is certainly optimistic about how the economy is going. I think other businesses are probably likely to be a little bit more cautious. There's a lot going on at this point that might make them a little bit reluctant to take on full-time permanent staff. So that's a dynamic that we could begin to see more. That is, more part-time workers coming on board maybe, but less sort of full-time permanent staff, just to reflect the fact that there is still such a high degree of uncertainty for the Australian business community.
Okay, and Peter says here that he's put COVID-19 under control. maybe the case here in New Zealand, but the rest of the world it's certainly not. I mean, what about that international aspect of the fact that it's not under control overseas on the Australian economic landscape?
Yeah, it's a huge question mark. Australia and New Zealand have done pretty much as well as you could expect at managing this, and both countries are well positioned to recover. But the reality is that countries are pretty small and we're impacted by global markets. And the fact that most of the major economies, we're talking the US, Europe, the UK, have a poor job at managing the spread of COVID-19, does suggest that these economies are going to weigh on the global recovery. That's going to have spillover impacts onto Australia. And broadly what that means is that the Australian and New Zealand recovery is likely to be a little bit slower than they otherwise would be because of this difficult global environment that we're operating in at the moment.
Okay, and Mark says once fiscal support is no longer there, so JobKeeper is reduced and JobKeeper is gone and JobSeeker payments are reduced, what do you think the impact will that be on the economy as well?
Well, we still have a little bit of time before they're fully diminished. The data we're receiving thus far indicates that the Australian business community seems to be doing okay with a sort of gradual reduction in JobKeeper payments so far. Obviously, Victoria's relying on them to a greater degree than the rest of the country. The hope is that come the end of March, the economy will be strong enough that Australian businesses can stand on their 2 feet. Now, unfortunately, the reality is that some businesses are probably relying on these support measures extensively, and the main reason why they've managed to continue operating. So I would expect that there will be a larger than normal number of bankruptcies once these policies are completely removed. That's just an unfortunate reality of what we've gone through. There will be sort of lasting damage, particularly to smaller businesses. But a lot can change between now and the end of March. So it's really fingers crossed that the economy is a little bit stronger, Australian businesses are doing a little bit better, and then that transition off JobKeeper can be relatively smooth. But certainly if there will be an impact, it will be felt primarily in the smaller business sector.
Right. Okay. Now, Marie, I'll just 2 more questions and then we'll let you go, Callum. Now, Marie Claire says that she's curious about, particularly in New Zealand, how they're going to cope with hiring talent, being able to hire talent from overseas, and whether there's going to be a change in where organisations are going to be more flexible in their requirements when they actually hire staff. Or do you have any comments on the fact that it is going to be harder to import talent? I know you had a couple of slides on it there.
Yeah. So there's also been a big change there. I mean, I focus primarily on Australia, but New Zealand's very much in the same boat. It'd be the case that Australia and New Zealand are sort of trying to attract talent from across the ocean, back and forth, maybe. But I think the reality is that businesses in both countries are going to need to learn how to do things a little bit differently. So there might be roles that you can do without, that you might sort of delay hiring because you know that role is going to be really difficult to fill. You might need to restructure teams or business operations so that you can do without certain roles, because it simply is going to be very difficult to get that talent from overseas. While both the Australian and New Zealand workforces are incredibly highly skilled, the skills that are being developed in a country don't always match with the skills that the business community are actively seeking, which is why skilled migration can be incredibly important. The fact that we won't be able to tap those markets in as great numbers as we normally do simply suggests that businesses are going to have to learn how to do things differently, whether it's restructuring teams or internal training or other methods as a stopgap until things return to normal.
Okay, good. And our last question from David here says, Callum, thank you for today, but could you please provide your expectations with the economy and the current issues with China here in Australia?
Look, it's certainly hard to comment on what's happening with China at the moment. There's obviously some issues. It hasn't necessarily affected the Australian economy thus far, although we have seen we could impact certain export markets. I know that there was greater tariffs on wine, for example. There could be other markets as well that are going to be impacted. Most of the trade we do with China is around commodities, iron ore and coal. if those commodity markets remain relatively unaffected, then we're not going to see a big trade impact from what's happening with China. But obviously, the relationship we have with China is something that we have to manage. They're very important to us from an economic standpoint. I think they account for almost 40% of our merchandise exports on a monthly basis. They are by far our biggest trading partner. And they're going to be important going forward to Australia's economic well-being. So how this evolves over the next few years is going to be incredibly important to how the Australian economy itself evolves.
So do you think economists are changing their forecast based on what's happening with China, or at this stage they're keeping their numbers stable?
Too early to really make any changes to forecasts just yet. But it would be considered a downside risk to any economic forecasts that are being made, whether it's from people such as myself, or whether it be official forecasts from Federal Treasury or the Reserve Bank of Australia. They'd all view this as a considerable downside risk to the Australian economic outlook.
Fantastic. Alrighty, well, thank you, Callum, and apologies again for the technical difficulties there. It's been a pleasure having you on our Leadership Series webinar this afternoon. If you'd like to see the slides again, the webinar will be on our website under events. There's the rest of the series is also there if you'd like to revisit those as well. But thank you, Callum, and I'll be following you closely on Twitter for all your insights going forward, and I encourage everybody else to do that. And thank you, everybody, for joining us this afternoon. We have another webinar next week, which is detailing a whole lot of information from our P2P post that we launched, our summary survey, specifically at job seekers next week. I'd encourage everybody to join that. But if you don't do that, then have a very merry and safe Christmas, and we'll see you all again in 2021.
Yeah, and we're just going to publish a poll before leaving. So if you can just answer this poll as soon as you, just before leaving, it would be awesome.
This is for Indeed, yes. So under the poll section, whilst you're watching here, would you like Indeed to contact you about your hiring need? Yes and no. Just click on that and they will get in touch for sure, particularly after today's presentation. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you again in the new year.